Hey everybody, welcome to the debut edition of the Gr8Wyte Experience, the show where I talk about anything and everything of interest. I am your host, Gibson. Thank you for listening. Today's episode marks a very special occasion, as this is the very first episode for this brand new podcast, which I'm very excited to be able to sit down and record for you today. And the topic for today's episode is one that I feel is going to be a great way to kick things off. Alright, so before I get into the topic of today's episode, there are some things that I need to clarify before we carry on. First off, what is the Gr8Wyte Experience? That's simple. This is a passion project which I've thought about doing for some time now, separate from the other podcasts that I host, a weekly Ottawa Senators hockey podcast called Third Line Plug Sensecast, which I started up in 2017 with my friend and co-host, Tim Jency. Next thing I have to clarify, what will this podcast be about? As I've said in the opening, it's going to be a show where I talk about anything and everything that I'm interested in. So for example, if I want to review an album, or talk about a movie, or just sit down and have a stupid conversation with one of my friends or somebody that I'm interested in, I can sit down and record it. Another thing I have to clarify is what inspired me to want to start a second podcast, including having interests outside of hockey, which I couldn't really explore with Third Line. My co-host Tim has his own podcast called Gr8Wyte, which is a show where he and his co-host talk about one of their favorite card games. And I was really inspired by him going on and doing his own podcast outside of Third Line Plug. And he told me one night after we recorded an episode that I should start a second podcast after I went on a 7 or 8 minute rant about Rammstein, who is one of my favorite bands, to close out an episode. And the final thing I have to clarify is how and why did I get into podcasting? So I actually got into podcasting in 2012, and over the years I've listened to quite a few podcasts that later became influences of mine, like the Jan Dan podcast and Tagger and Torrens, just to name a few. From the shows, I would go on to discover other shows like Maple Syrup Shots and Podcast, who would also become an influence, and also discovered the Sens Call-Ups in 2017, which became the direct influence and inspiration for Third Line Plug. However, the guy that really got me into podcasting was Kevin Smith. And for those who don't know, Kevin is a film director, podcaster, comic book writer, just to name a few things that he does. Kevin hosts a number of podcasts, one of which being Smodcast, which he started with his friend and producer, Scott Mosier. Smodcast was a real game changer for me, as it got me interested in listening to podcasts, which later grew into inspiration to want to do my own. Over the last couple of years, I've been very lucky enough to meet or work with the people who inspired me to get into podcasting. Last couple of years ago, I got to meet Jay and Dan. I got to meet Tagger and Torrens. Through doing Third Line Plug, I got to work with Pan and Canuck from the Sens Call-Ups. And a couple of years ago, after a live Hollywood Babylon in Vancouver, I actually got to meet Kevin Smith. And since that day, I really regret not thanking Kevin for sparking my interest in podcasting. And I felt the best way to thank him is to kick off this podcast by doing it about him. Today's episode is on my favorite Kevin Smith movies. So just a quick disclaimer, I'm only going to be talking about his movies, not his podcasts, books, or Q&A DVDs, which, if I'm being perfectly honest, I feel are way funnier than his movies are, but that's not the point. So without further ado, let's begin. Kicking off this list is a movie which I know is going to surprise some people given how loved Kevin Smith's early work is. At number 3, Red State. So I'll be the first person to admit that I'm not a huge horror movie fan. It's never been a genre that I've been that into, despite some really classic flicks that people are over the moon about. However, despite that, 2011's Red State is a horror movie that I actually got into and was really invested in, for the simple fact that the idea of a hate group disguised as a church taking people hostage is actually kind of a terrifying idea. So the plot of the movie is about these 3 teenagers who meet a woman on an internet hookup site, only to have the woman drug them and take them to the 5 Points Trinity Church, run by preacher Aben Cooper, who is played by the now late Michael Parks. With a cast like Red State that includes names like John Goodman and Kevin Pollak, it was Michael Parks who really stole this movie. Right from the beginning, he just grabs your attention in the role with his presence, as he portrays a guy who can be charming, funny, menacing. He could be all these things and do it believable. Including Park's performance as Aben Cooper, a number of things about Red State worked for me. I really thought the characters were really believable. The suspense was actually pretty effective, especially in the chase scenes with the shaky cam. And there is one particular scene in the movie that really got under my skin. And I'm not going to lie, I actually turned the movie off the first time I ever saw it. And there's a scene, it's the first scene in the movie where you actually see them in the church. And it's kind of a spoiler. If you're into spoilers, you can fast forward a little bit now. But there was an execution scene with somebody taped to a cross. That, I mean, I'm sorry. I was beside myself the first time I saw that. And it's such an effective scene because anytime I think about Red State, I instantly think of that. And it still gets under my skin every time that I see it. And while I do think the positives outweigh the negatives, Red State is not a perfect movie by any means. I felt that the pacing of the flick was a bit off, and while I did enjoy the shootout in the third act, it just felt like a different movie because you go from a movie that was so suspenseful and you kind of want these kids to escape and you're just like, well, what are these guys going to do? To all of a sudden it becomes like an action movie, and it is a little bit distracting that I felt, but for me, it's such a well done scene, and while it doesn't really have much to do with the flick, as you see it in the first two acts, but it's still a pretty good scene. However, it did make it feel like a totally different movie. I would recommend Red State to anybody who enjoys horror, likes a great assembled cast, or is just a Kevin Smith fan that wants something that is terrifying yet not overly goofy, like Tusk. Coming in at number 2 is a movie that I know many people will completely disagree with having on this list, and I totally understand why. My number 2 pick is Clerks 2. So, hear me out on this one. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Clerks 2 is a better overall movie than Clerks, because it isn't. The movie is superior in pretty much every way. However, for myself, I just found that I enjoyed Clerks 2 more than I did with the original. Now, before I get into what I really did like about Clerks 2, I want to talk a little bit about my main issue. And one of the big complaints that I have with the flick, and I think a lot of people had with the movie, was the elaborate dance scene. Now, I'm not referring to the part of the dance scene on top of the movies between Becky and Dante, but the big musical number that breaks out, which I actually found really distracting for the simple fact that outside of it being this big spectacle, it really doesn't serve much of a purpose to the film, as the film is not really suited for that. And I think that's more of a response by Kevin Smith, because his critics always said that, oh, his movies are always talking, there's not a lot of movement, and now he does this big elaborate scene to be like, oh, well, there you go, I just showed you that I can do that. And I'm not saying this scene isn't done well, I'm saying it just doesn't fit with the movie as a whole. If the film had simply just focused on Dante and Becky on the rooftop, I think it would have made a much better scene. It would have served better for the flick itself. But that's pretty much all that I have when it comes to criticism. So now that I got my main issue of Clerks 2 out of the way, let's go into talk about what I really enjoyed about it. Like what I said about Red State, Clerks 2 is also a movie that has more going for it than against it. As a continuation of the original, I thought it really did a good job at doing that, while naturally expanding that universe, including the returning cast of Clerks. The cast of Clerks 2 was really strong here, with Rosario Dawson as Becky being a main highlight, as she just killed it as Becky. Brian O'Halloran, once again, was great as Dante. Jason Mewes and Kevin Smith as Jay and Silent Bob were fantastic. And, of course, it wouldn't be a View Askew flick without guys like Ben Affleck, Jason Lee, and Ethan Suplee, who, funny enough, Lee and Suplee were castmates on My Name is Earl at the time of the movie. The movie itself has some really funny moments, and none of them, absolutely none of the scenes in this movie will top the donkey sex show scene, which, in writing this episode, I actually had to go back and watch that scene again, because I've got to say that's easily my favorite scene in the movie because of how ridiculous the whole thing is. Anytime I see the sexy stud, when he spits and the spit goes through his hand, I crack up. Even just talking about it, it makes me laugh so hard every time I think about it. And funny enough, and this is a really fun fact, is if you watch the documentary on the Clerks 2 DVD, Rosario Dawson actually talks about how this scene was what made her agree to do Clerks 2. That's kind of funny. And she even said in the documentary, she's just like, I did it simply because I wanted to see a donkey sex show. So, with many of the positives going for the flick, the biggest positive it has going for it, once again, is Jeff Anderson as Randall. With the cast of two all doing great jobs in their roles, it was Anderson's portrayal of Randall that really shined the most. While he killed it once again comedically, it was actually his work and him portraying the emotions and the human side of Randall as he's now trying to come to terms with a reality that he has no choice in, which is life without Dante, which is a big thing in the movie where Dante is got engaged, he's going to move to Florida, run a car wash, and Randall has no control of him leaving. While taking nothing away from Dante's character development in the movie, it was Randall that really stuck with me, as really he went from being this carefree slacker to a guy who is simply trying to come to terms with the reality he has no control over, which is, again, his life without Dante around. And what I really like about this development is that it wasn't just, they go through the whole movie and then right at the end it comes up. Gradually throughout the movie, you see Randall and his feelings on the matter ascending from the opening scene of the car to the sad rotating shot set to 1979 by the Smashing Pumpkins, which is a great song, I'm not going to lie, to concluding in the jail scene where he admits to Dante's feelings on the matter and tells him to not leave him. And both Jeff Anderson and Kevin Smith have gone on record during an episode of Smodcast from 2014 stating that the jailhouse scene was their favorite scene in Clerks 2, with Smith going on record saying Clerks 2 was his favorite movie that he's made. And I personally would agree with that because honestly, I felt Jeff Anderson killed it in this role, and I thought he was amazing. And what more are you to say? I mean, if you're open-minded enough to a sequel to Clerks, I think you're going to enjoy it. And now we've come to my pick for my all-time favorite Kevin Smith movie. And it's a movie that is widely regarded as Kevin Smith's best work and generally considered to be many fans' favorite flick, the controversial 1998 movie Dogma. With any film that is based on stories from the Bible, said films are always going to have a strong polarizing reaction given its source material and the target audience. While films like The Last Temptation of Christ and Passion of the Christ are seen as classics or overly violent, Dogma went a different route by being a religious satire. At the time of its release, the movie was seen as quite controversial for its irreverent treatment of Catholicism and the Catholic Church, which led to the Catholic League denouncing the movie. There were death threats against Kevin Smith, groups organized protests against the film, one of which was actually attended by Kevin Smith himself, which he talks about in his Q&A DVD, An Evening With. And while the movie itself is not the first of its kind, I do feel that Dogma honestly did it best with respect to Monty Python's Life of Brian, which I have not seen, but I do plan on watching it one day. As somebody who attended a Catholic school for 4 years, I do feel that the movie does a great job with its themes regarding religion, most notably Catholicism, while raising some really good points in the movie. I felt that Chris Rock's speech about having ideas over beliefs was really kind of thought-provoking for myself, and while I didn't find it preachy or forceful, and I think that's kind of why I kind of was fine with it, the movie itself has so much going for it. And while it's easy to point out Kevin Smith's strength as a filmmaker when it comes to his dialogue, I always found that this movie was made much better with the strong cast that it had. Linda Fiorentino as Bethany was a really great character. Ben Affleck and Matt Damon, I thought they were great as Barnaby and Loki, proving that their chemistry they had in Good Will Hunting was not a fluke. The supporting cast that included Salma Hayek, Jason Lee, and Chris Rock were all great. The Metatron, played by Alan Rickman, was fantastic. Jason Mewes, not actually as distracting as you would think in this movie as Jay. And while he did have limited screen time, George Carlin as Cardinal Glick was really, really well cast and really good. The only real issue I have with the movie isn't so much the reveal of God at the end of the movie, spoiler, but simply who they got as God. While throughout the movie there is no real concrete answer whether God is male or female, until the final scene where Bartleby opens the doors of the church to reveal God was played by, spoiler, Alanis Morissette. Anytime I watch this movie, I'm always left scratching my head regarding how I really feel about Morissette as God. And at the time of the movie's release, Alanis Morissette was one of the biggest musical acts on the planet. However, I feel like some 20 years after the fact, Morissette as God, I don't think has much of an impact anymore on people who are watching it for the first time now, as they probably just look at it and go, yeah, okay. Despite that, I really enjoyed Dogma. I always love it every time I watch it. The humor is great. The cast was fantastic. Its themes on Catholicism are strong but not overbearing. And that's why Dogma is my all-time favorite Kevin Smith movie. So that's my list of my favorite Kevin Smith movies. Maybe in the future I might go do full reviews of these movies and go more in depth and detail about them individually. If you got any comments or thoughts about the movies I mentioned, please leave a comment below and let me know. Until then, I am your host Taylor Gibson, and I'll see you next time.